1 and 2, and the question is that clauses 1 and 2 stand apart.
Mr. Chair.
David Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your advice earlier. I do appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity to make a wide-ranging contribution to this debate. Mr. Chair, I do feel strongly about this, and I will certainly be speaking, though, to one clause in the bill, and that is clause 2, the commencement, and subpart 2, where I wish that the House consider that we change the commencement date to the 1st of April 2018. I think that way we could be certain that a government that cares about state housing, a government that cares about our most vulnerable, will be in government, and we can have that debate again. We can ensure that this is never implemented. So, Mr. Chair, that would be what I will move, and that is for the reasons that I am now about to give. Mr. Chair, what has happened here with this bill is that we are rushing it through the House without the opportunity for public input. It is a bill deliberately designed to reduce state housing in this country. It is designed to take government out of the provision of social housing. And as we've heard from many members in this House, the problem with that is that the private market is not delivering the affordable and adequate social housing that is desperately needed in our society. I will give another example, Mr. Chair, that has not been brought up. This is an example of a woman that I met just last weekend on one of my home visits in the suburb of Waikato. I went to visit this woman, and she said she was quite happy for me to tell her story because she feels strongly about this. Waikato in Dunedin. She said to me she is fearful that she will not be allowed to stay in her state house any longer. It is a 3-bedroom state house. She is now living on her own, but she uses the other 2 bedrooms frequently to take care of her grandchildren when her son is called to work at short notice. She has grandchildren that she cares for in that house. She's lived in it for a good chunk of her life because for one reason and another, she's never had the opportunity or the prospect of affording to buy her own home. She would love to, but she's never been in a position to afford her own home. So the state has said, look, we will look out for you. You are a good contributor to our society. She's always worked up until recently, and she is now unable to find work as she rapidly approaches retirement. She has been made redundant several times. There is just simply not enough work in Dunedin for this woman who would like to work like she has her whole life in order to keep affording a standard of living that we could call living with dignity. She now tells me she has to save to buy a cup of coffee. She's got a good friend who rings her up every week and says, let's go out for coffee. She is embarrassed by the fact that she cannot go out every week with that friend because she cannot afford the cup of coffee. When she has paid her insurance, which she does refuse to give up, Mr. Chair, and she says that that is discretionary, but when she refuses to pay her insurance, she has only $20 left over every week with which to feed herself. She has an elderly dog that she refuses to give away, that she's cared for many years. She said that dog eats pretty close to $20 worth of dog food a week. She's got nothing. Absolutely nothing for her to live off each week. When she goes to get a haircut, her kids donate her money to get a haircut. That is not the kind of living in dignity that we would want for our citizens. That's not the New Zealand I signed up to, where someone who has worked for their whole working life, bar the last few years because they can't get work, is forced to worry about whether they're going to have a stable place to live, whether they can care for their grandchildren adequately. And even now, she's living in a house that is fairly cold, I would have to say, from having visited her. She is a good woman. We need to make sure that in our society there is adequate protection, that people who are in need are looked out for and looked after so they can continue to make a constructive contribution to our society through the caring of grandchildren, through the voluntary community work that woman does, and through other means, Mr. Chair. So what I want to make, the point that I want to come back to, Mr. Chair, is that the case for this particular intervention has not been made because there is a market failure. I mentioned this in my earlier contribution, the market failure which sees many families who want to get into affordable houses unable to get into them, who want to provide warm, dry homes for their kids to live in, being forced onto the private market because of unmet need in the state sector. Those people are in a position where they cannot get what they need out of the private sector, Mr. Chair. Now, if we had an adequate state housing sector, that would force private sector providers to meet that need at the level that the state housing sector meets it, that addresses that market failure and the unintended consequences we see in the existing market. Now, one thing that I have noticed, Mr Chair, in all of the legislation that's gone through the House is that there has been a lack, Mr Chair.
Chris Barfoy.